Hello, I want to welcome you all here today. My name is Dr. Shel Watts, and I am the president and founder of MBAAdmit.com. I'm here today to share with you some success practices for Indian, East Asian, European, and other foreign nationals. So today's talk will really be relevant to, relevant to anyone who is a foreign national at the time of applying to a U.S. or a European school. I get a lot of questions often about, are there specific things or specific tips that are relevant to candidates of that background, and the answer is yes. So today I look forward to sharing some of those insights with you. I wanted to bring to your attention that there are certain things that we would like to offer you today for attending today's session. We are offering at this web address here a free profile evaluation, an opportunity for you to sign up for our newsletter, excellent pricing on our gold service, which is a comprehensive service on application consulting, and then finally a free ebook that will be available through August 15th. So feel free to visit that address and take advantage of those offers. Before we get into this session, first I want to thank Beat the GMAT for hosting me once again. We love working with Beat the GMAT. We want to tell you a little bit about our company. So MBA Admit has been around for quite a long time. I, as the president and founder, have been providing advising for over 25 years. We've had success with all the top MBA programs, and we're very happy to leverage the expertise that we have, particularly with the top 10 MBA programs and those MBA programs that also have a tech focus. We are very comprehensive in the services we offer, so we'll do everything from a light review of a finished essay to comprehensive from beginning to the end service, where we're helping people to develop their ideas, write the stories, and express their stories in the right way, and then provide feedback to the recommendation writers. So depending on your needs, just be in touch with us and we'll let you know what we can do for you. We have had success with all the top programs. We know each of the programs very intimately, and so we know the nuances of admissions. And feel free to visit our website to take a look at some of our testimonials. Again, I do welcome you to sign up for our newsletter because there's always things that we'd love to touch on in these sessions, and given the limitations of time, we're just not able to get to everything. So again, feel free to visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. Okay, so for today's talk, we want to be touching on the 4 areas in which to demonstrate excellence for top MBA program admission success. And then we're going to take it down into the more specific issues of ways for you as a foreign national to do certain practices that can help you to succeed. We're actually going to point out 11 common mistakes and then talk about what would be the success practice if you're trying to avoid that mistake. As we do that, I want to just remind you that with Beat the GMAT, I have hosted a couple of, or done a couple of additional webinars or chats where we've touched on the broader strategies to employ in MBA admissions in order to get successful outcomes. So we're not going to touch on the full breadth of those today, the general practices, because we want to focus specifically on those that are of pertinence to the foreign national. So I do invite you to go and visit and take a look at these 2 in particular, the June 22nd webinar with Beat the GMAT, where we touched on gaining admissions to the top MBA programs, and then the February 2014 chat with Beat the GMAT, where we talked about starting early and 10 success practices for round 1 admissions success. So today, foreign nationals, who are we talking about? A lot of times when we do start to talk about foreign nationals, people want to know, well, who is that? Who is the foreign national? Foreign national, what I mean by that is simply, if you are applying to a school, you are not a citizen of the school where of the country where the school is located. So that would mean you're a foreign national. If you're in India, you're a foreign national to a U.S. school. You're a foreign national also to a school located in England. So that's the basic definition. Permanent resident, people ask me, well, is that the same? So if someone is technically of Indian citizenship and living in the United States but has gained permanent residency in the United States, are they still treated as a foreign national? In many cases, they are not. It's a separate sort of category, and often a more advantageous category because from the perspective of the schools, it might be easier to place you in a job afterwards. So permanent residents typically will have a little bit more easy in the admissions process, but many of these same best practices apply to permanent residents. So if you are a permanent resident, I do encourage you to continue to look on and hear the tips in this webinar. And then finally, which schools am I speaking about? Today's talk is focusing mostly on US-based schools and schools in England or Europe. And so these bits of advice apply to the foreign national applying to schools in those areas. So the broadest way to take a look at this before we get into the foreign national discussion is overall, as a candidate, what should you be striving to do by way of showing excellence? There are 4 main areas in which to demonstrate excellence. And if you do this, you're showing that you're a top choice admit. So the 3 core areas are professional success, academic success, and extracurricular success. And so what you're striving to do as you put together the application, the resume, and your essays is to showcase your strengths in each of those areas. You want to show that you have great knowledge and skills to share, that you will be able to bring unique insights into the classroom, both professional and personal, that you're a leader who's known for vision and innovation, that you have a great potential to make an impact as an MBA student, as an alumni member, and as a future business leader in your career. So that is the general sort of position you want to try to convey in your essays, the recommendations, and the resume, as well as the application form itself. And you should, when you're doing that, you should be thinking about, how do I show that in my past in terms of that success, how do I show it currently, and then how do I project it into the future. There's a 4th area which, if someone has it, certainly they should showcase it, and that is basically strength in their personal story. Now, personal story, I define very broadly. It can mean personal achievements, your actual personal background, or just influential personal experiences that have shaped your philosophy of life, how you go about things, what you're passionate about. And so if you have a strong story, you should certainly showcase it, because that just distinguishes you more from the other people who are applying, and usually does make you a more compelling candidate. I can speak later in the session about what makes for a compelling personal story. It can be many different things, so it doesn't have to be a story about someone who came from poverty and overcame it. There are people who come from wealth but can also tell a story about how that personal background has shaped them, made them passionate, inspired them to have an impact. And so we can talk about that more in the Q&A. There's also, of course, those 2, the webinar and the chat that I mentioned earlier, where we go into some depth about that. So what I want to really focus on today is, for the foreign national, assuming you do all the other things I just mentioned in terms of demonstrating excellence in those areas, what additional things are helpful to you if you're trying to maximize your odds of success in the MBA admissions process, both in the United States and or Europe and England. So this is what we're going to delve into now. I'm going to present 11 common mistakes, and then the success practices that can help you to avoid those mistakes. Number 1, failure to explain why you need an international MBA. I use the word international simply to say it's an MBA program that's a top program and not located in the country where you are a citizen. So if it is a top school, if it is Columbia University or Stanford or Cornell or Yale, and you're located in another country, so say you're in Kenya or you are in China, why do you need to go to another country, to one of the top schools in that other country, and get your MBA there instead of where you're located? And so you need to explain that. If you do not explain it, the school can get the impression that you actually don't need to do that, and that will hurt you in the admissions process. They want to award their MBAs to folks who are aiming high in their careers, for folks who have a reason to need that international exposure. So perhaps what you're doing will require a strong alumni network that's global. And so, again, you need to pay attention to, have I conveyed to the admissions committee why I actually need this international MBA? The long-term goal can be very significant for that. And most certainly you do not want to come across as someone who's aiming to have a mom and pop or a very small business that you're seeking to be running in the future, because in those circumstances, typically the admissions committee will assume that you actually don't need to have the international MBA. So pay attention to that. It can have a very big initial impact on how your application is received. Common mistake number 2, applying to schools that do not favor your part of the world. So the success practice to get around that is to apply to some schools that are known to be more receptive to candidates from your part of the world. Now, normally the first question I'm going to have is, well, how do I know which top MBA programs don't favor my part of the world? You know, an obvious response might be that you find a really good consultant. Not everyone wants to use consultants or can use consultants, and so the next thing that you could do is to go into a wonderful location like Beat the GMAT and take a good look at the, what other candidates are saying in terms of their outcomes, what consultants are advising, and you'll pick up on some trends that some schools truly do favor candidates from some parts of the world, and others don't. And so you should have a sense of that. I don't say don't apply to a school that does not favor your part of the world, but I do say if you're going to apply to 2 or 3 like that, and you want to most definitely go to school the very next year, then you need to add on schools that are known to be more receptive to your part of the world. And that's just a basic practice in terms of trying to maximize your odds of success at one of the top schools. Now, for example, if you are a very strong candidate from Africa, by which I mean that you've demonstrated the success in many of those 4 areas, you should be targeting, of course, top programs, but there are certain programs in the United States, for instance, that are targeting candidates from Africa. They're very interested in building up their portion of the student body that comes from Africa. They're launching out Africa-focused programs, and you'll notice that there are also very strong Africa clubs at those schools. And so, for instance, Stanford is one of those. It has now some scholarships for students from Africa. Columbia has a very strong Africa club. Wharton and Harvard are also 2 that have very strong Africa clubs. Harvard, in fact, had the first, to my knowledge, the first Africa club at the business school, and it is extremely powerful, a very amazing network to draw on. So if you know that, then you know that these schools will find a strong candidate from Africa very attractive, and so those schools may have a more prominent place on your list than other schools where the population from Africa in terms of the student body is quite small. The same thing for students from Latin America. A lot of Latin American candidates find that schools in California are very receptive to them, and that's pretty obviously because of the strong ties between California and Latin America. Candidates from India and East Asia, you can do your homework and also find out what schools are much more receptive to foreign nationals from India and East Asia than others. And so, for instance, Wharton is very receptive to the Indian candidate. And I believe other schools, very tech-focused schools like Duke and Ross, very receptive to Indian foreign nationals. And then again, East Asian candidates do well at many of the top schools, including schools like MIT and Kellogg. And so I can't underscore enough, this doesn't mean don't apply to schools where you get a sense that they are less receptive. It's just that if you're trying to maximize your odds of success, you would add on some that are known to be receptive. The same thing applies to this next bit of advice. Common mistake number 3 is applying only to schools that do not favor your profile. Success practice would be to apply to some schools that are receptive to candidates with your profile. When I'm saying profile, I'm meaning more than just your country of origin. So we're talking more than just about what country you come from. So more specifically, if you are a tech candidate from India applying to Columbia Business School, there's a belief among some people that Columbia Business School is more receptive to Indian foreign nationals who come from family businesses. So if you start to do your research and you think that this is true, then you would say, okay, I still love Columbia, I believe it's the right school for me, but I'm going to add on some additional schools that tend to favor Indian foreign nationals who have a technology background. For a foreign national engineer applying to University of Chicago, now, University of Chicago is known for a finance focus and also a mainstream focus. And so the number of seats they may have reserved for foreign national engineer might be much smaller than the number that they have reserved at Duke. And so, again, if you're sold on the idea that University of Chicago is the right place for you, apply, but understand that the odds may be smaller there because of the focuses of the schools. And if you really want to go to business school next year at a top school, you will add on some additional schools that are known to favor candidates of your profile. Common mistake number 4 would be underestimating the impact of the round in which you are applying. Now, this is going to vary based on what country you come from and your profile, but the success practice is target rounds in which you have a large number of seats available for candidates with your profile. So in most cases, I'm talking about round 1 versus round 2, that for some candidates with certain profiles, if you wait until round 2, there are so few seats left that your odds of success are extremely low, even if you are phenomenally qualified. And the reason that there are so few seats left is that the school has in its mind sort of set aside a certain number for foreign nationals from your country, and in round 1 the volume of candidates who have applied of that profile who are extremely qualified was so high that the school simply filled the seats, most of the seats, and so by round 2 there are very few left. And so most of you will probably know that this applies most firmly to Indian foreign national male engineers. And so basically that profile is so competitive where the GPAs and the GMAT scores tend to be so high and then the work experience very solid that the volume applying in round 1 will often have success and take a lot of the seats, such that by round 2 for the very top schools there are very few seats left to be allocated to others, even if they are very qualified. So for the Indian foreign national male, you would want to think about timing your applications very well. There are schools still in round 2 where admissions is possible, but you would want to know very specifically what schools those tend to be, because certain schools do tend to be more open in round 2. The same advice goes for rolling admissions, that if you are of a candidate profile where a large number of other candidates of your profile apply to your target school and the admission is rolling, you want to be able to apply as early as possible in that rolling admissions so that, you know, at the midpoint of the rolling admissions cycle, you don't find yourself in a situation where all the seats have been allocated to candidates of your profile. So the timing becomes very important. Now, this is not a simple calculation necessarily for you as a candidate. So you really need to understand how does your particular profile affect this whole calculation, and certain things about your profile will impact it: gender, country, region, industry. So I spoke about Indian foreign national men. For Indian foreign national women, it's a different calculation, so things will not be as competitive and as difficult, and a round 2 application is much more likely to be successful. Even the industry matters. So again, the Indian foreign national male engineer, what about the Indian foreign national male financial expert? That could be very different in a round 2 application. So getting to know how each aspect of your candidacy, of your profile, affects this calculation is important. And you can gain some of that information, some of that knowledge from, feedback sessions with consultants, and also from going to places like Beat the GMAT and taking a good look at the advice that's there, both through consultants and from other applicants. Here are some examples. I will go to the last one here. The African, Latin American, European, or Middle Eastern foreign national applying to a top 10 school. If that happens, if they want to put together a round 2 application, most of the times the fact that it's a round 2 application will not have much of an adverse impact on candidates from those parts of the world. So you should know that if you're coming from those parts of the world, that round 2 typically doesn't hurt you. And as I mentioned in the first 2 examples, that for the male coming out of India, and for some males, it depends on where in East Asia, because East Asia is obviously a big and diverse place, but certain countries, China for instance, a round 2 application may be harder than a round 1 application, and that will vary based on country. So someone from Malaysia, it's going to be a different situation, and a Malaysian applicant in round 2 will tend to be fine, whereas someone from China in round 2, depending on the school, it may be a very difficult set of odds that you are facing. Common mistake number 5 is underestimating the impact of the TOEFL or GMAT verbal scores. Now, the success practice is if you find that your TOEFL or your GMAT verbal scores are notably low, that you should try to take an English course or 2 to bring improvement before applying. Now, some people really don't want to put in the time and effort to do that, but this can really derail even a very strong application. And why is that? Because as the takeaway says, it's not all about you. Now, what do I mean by that? Why is it not all about you? Because there's a two-way analysis going on. As you look at the school and you decide this school is perfect for me, I really would love the curriculum, the alumni network, everything, all the resources it provides me, you may be sold that yes, I can get into the classroom and I can gain in the classroom and I can understand English enough to gain and be able to do my work. From the point of view of the admissions committee, all those things are important as they're assessing whether to admit you. Is it the right program? Will you be able to do the work? But there's another layer for the admissions committee. The other layer is if they put you in the seat in the classroom, will you be able to express yourself well enough that your peers can benefit from your presence? And if the answer is no, then they don't have incentive to put you in the seat, because part of what they're trying to achieve is a very dynamic and robust learning environment in which each of the admits will be able to benefit from the other candidates and young leaders who were admitted to the class. So the whole issue of can you express yourself is a very important one. And so if the TOEFL or the verbal GMAT score flags to the school that there is an issue with regard to communication, the school may simply say, we're going to say no right now, and if you come back later with a stronger set of scores, you would get hopefully a different outcome. And so certain things that you should do, look into what the minimal acceptable TOEFL score is for a school. Many of the top schools do put a number on their website and say this is the minimum, and that they are expecting that you will hit that minimum or higher in order to have a shot of admissions. Another thing, even if you do end up getting strong TOEFL scores or a strong GMAT verbal score, you have to still be able to express yourself well in an interview. And so it may just be the case that you're better at writing than you are at speaking, and then you get to the interview and you can't answer basic questions. That would be a problem. Now, some people are able to get coached enough that they get into the interview and they can do well enough because they've rehearsed all of those great questions. But I would still be encouraging people to go and take English courses before you start the program. One example that would give people some hope is I had a candidate once from China who had a 2.9 GPA, so very poor GPA. That was not because of conversion, it was really a 2.9 GPA. and he wanted to get to Harvard. Now, he had an amazing professional work experience at a top Fortune company, and his whole story was wonderful, and he actually did have a reason why the GPA was low, and he also had, unfortunately, a troubling TOEFL and verbal GMAT score, but the quant was quite high. So there were these challenges in the academic profile, but a wonderful, beautiful professional profile. So we just did our best. We put together the best possible application, sent it to Harvard, and he was actually admitted with the low GMAT score and with the troubling TOEFL score. The school admitted him on the condition that he took a course over the summer that they had identified before beginning the program, and so he did, and he went to Harvard and has since graduated. That is a wonderful story, but I do have to say I believe that is the exception and not the rule. And so for you, you should be assuming that many schools won't give you that opportunity. And so you should try to make sure that the English component is not something that will be an obstacle to you in the admissions process. Common mistake number 4, underestimating or overestimating the impact of the GMAT score. So the success practice would be, know that the top business schools will have expectations based on what is typical for your profile. And so, for example, sometimes I get a candidate who says, I've heard that if I have a 690, I will automatically be rejected at top 10 schools like Haas and Columbia. That is not necessarily true. Now, why is that not true? It's because the schools, they see all these candidates over the years. They see the candidates coming out of each part of the world in each specific country, and they know what the trends are. And so they may know that for the top candidates out of India, the typical score is 740 or 750. For the top candidates out of Latin America or a specific country like Mexico, a typical score might be 690. Now, so if you're coming from Mexico, the 690 will not necessarily look low. If you're coming from India, the 690 will look low. So the score and how high it needs to be is somewhat impacted by what country are you coming from, and basically what do the scores typically look like for the top candidates. And a reason why you might have a lower score from a candidate coming out of Mexico is because English is the second language, and they may not have been taught in the university at an English-speaking school. And so the score would naturally be lower, and usually because of the verbal component of the GMAT. And so the school knows that and takes that into account. So do your homework. If you're concerned about your GMAT score and whether it's just too low, try to do your homework and find out for your country in particular, what do the scores typically look like, and where are you in terms of that spectrum. Another example, I had a candidate years back who was a German doctor turned businessman. He had a 680 GMAT score, which was off at that time. I think the more typical score for Stanford at that time was about a 720. And he had an amazing, story in terms of his trajectory to business and very impressive long-term goals. And so he was able to make it in with the 680. And so, again, that was impacted by being European and also being a non-traditional applicant. And then finally, I just touched on Latin Americans with the 680. There's also the case that there's plenty of candidates from other parts of the world, like the Middle East or Africa, where the score might be 680, might be 650, and the candidates do quite well still in admissions to the top programs like Haas or INSEAD. Number 7, getting too anxious about GPA conversion can be a common mistake. The success practice is to know that the top schools will have databases about performance levels at your school, and they will know a good performance. And so this applies to most of the well-known schools in each of the countries. And so over the years, the schools have been receiving applications from candidates from all these countries and graduates from these universities. So they will have traced over time what a GPA from your school should look like by field. And they will also have a record of, if they admitted people with certain GPAs from your school, how they did at their school. So it's a huge database that they will have to help them make decisions about your performance and how to interpret your performance. So I have many candidates who are so worried because when they go and they try to convert, their GPA from their university in a different country to the 4.0 system, they end up with GPAs like 2.1 or 1.5, or 2.9, and they're thinking, okay, this is the end for me in the admissions process. That is not necessarily the case because, again, the top business schools will have these great databases that help to guide them. And so if you're trying to understand how they will interpret your performance, it's better and easier for you to figure out what is your ranking in the class. And so by raw ranking, I mean literally your number. So if you had 80 people in your class and you know that you're number 6, then you're obviously toward the top of the class, and therefore you will be perceived as having a top performance, and you should be certainly trying to point out your class ranking as you do your interview, in your essays, and so forth. But again, the database that the school has will most likely flag them to the fact that you probably had a top performance based on what the GPA was. And I mean the GPA in your system, not converted. And then in terms of percentile, it's the same thing, that you can do your percentile ranking. If you know that you're number 6 of 80, you can just do the math there. Some people only know percentile, so they might say, I know I was in the top 10% because I got some award at the end and it was for the top 10% of students. Then you should be conveying that information, and that should help you understand also that they will perceive your performance as top because you were in the top 10 percentile. And again, they will probably have that information or a strong sense of it, again, because of their own databases. So one more example to provide is when someone comes from another country, whether India or China or someplace abroad, and they say, look, I have a 6.8 of 10, and that I know that doesn't sound good, and they're worried. Well, 6.8 can be different things from different universities, and so at some universities in India or China, that would be a top 10% performance. In other schools, it might be a bottom 25% performance, but again, most likely the school will be aware of it. And if it is a top performance at your school, you should certainly be trying to point that out in the essays, the resume, and in the interviews. The good news is that many candidates can succeed even when their GPA conversions look horrible. And so an example would be many of my recent South African candidates who, when they did their conversion, it looked absolutely horrible, have gained admissions to Columbia, to Stanford, to Wharton. And so that conversion number really can be misleading for candidates. And another example, I had a Norwegian candidate just a year ago who, had a very difficult time trying to understand how his GPA would be perceived. And from what we could gather based on his ranking in the class and so forth, he looked like a strong, not the top, but strong student. And that was consistent with his outcomes. He got into Tuck, INSEAD, Yale. And so therefore, the point is again underscored that the conversion can be misleading. So don't get overly worried. Just try to assess exactly what it means based on your percentile or your raw ranking in your class. Common mistake number 8 is underestimating the impact of a strong application. The success practice is to strive to put together an outstanding application in order to stand out from the pack. So I've actually had candidates who, are coming to me pretty convinced that they can't get into a top school because they've talked to people and the people have heard about what their GPA performance was and said, you're never going to get into Duke. You can only apply to some of the smaller schools in the South that focus on technology. And then I'm looking at them thinking, you look pretty similar to most of the candidates I helped get into Duke. I don't see why you wouldn't get in there. But they are basing everything based on only kind of things like the GMAT score and the GPA without really understanding how much a strong application can influence outcomes. And so, once working with those candidates and we put these great applications together, then they're like, now I get it. I see how much this really could influence outcomes. And so don't underestimate how important the application is. And some people would say it's like a marketing package. And so put it together as well as you can and skillfully address weaknesses if you have them. And that doesn't mean you address those directly. Sometimes you do it indirectly, and that's more effective. And then be very meticulous in highlighting all the wonderful things that would want the school to say yes to you as a candidate. and the impact of the application can be significant. So there are lots of examples. This German doctor-turned businessman that I spoke about had actually twice applied to the top schools, all the top schools. So Stanford, Harvard, Wharton, Columbia, and had been rejected for 2 years in a row from all of the schools. And so then he comes to me, and I love this sort of candidate because he looked so fantastic and everything. The GMAT score was a soft spot, but everything else was fantastic, and I knew obviously you just didn't put together a very strong application. I felt he would have good outcomes in spite of the 2 years worth of rejections, and surely enough he actually got into every single school. So it was Wharton, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Columbia, successes at all 5. And so, you know, the application is huge. Put a great deal of effort and time into preparing your application. And then hopefully if you do have some things that are points of concern, you might be able to override those things. Another example, a Middle Eastern candidate with a 660 GMAT score, very, very concerned about it. But again, the strong application allows him to get around that and gain admission to LBS and Duke. Common mistake number 9, underestimating the impact of recommendations. The success practice is to take assertive steps to cultivate glowing recommendations. And when you do this, just always remember that even if you have an outstanding application in every single way, but you then have one lukewarm recommendation that simply says, oh, his performance was good, it was competent, it was reasonably satisfactory, you're derailing the entire application. And given how competitive some profiles can be, that one recommendation that is flat can actually end a bid at a top school. And so you have to be very, very careful with who you are choosing. And hopefully you're going to make sure that you work with that writer enough in terms of helping them understand what sorts of information to convey and how to convey it, and to be very careful about what they write about as your weakness, that if you're able to make sure that they are writing a recommendation that is glowing about you and speaks about you as someone that is worthy of being invested in by an MBA program, and projects you as just someone who has a very, you know, promising future. That is the sort of recommendation that can distinguish you from the pack and can also make sure that the application is not derailed. So make sure you're working with these rec writers early and that they have a deep understanding of what is needed in a strong recommendation, and hopefully that will have a positive influence on your outcomes. And then common mistake number 10 is underestimating the impact of your company. I can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A, but long story short, some of these top MBA programs really do have a strong bias toward the top Fortune companies that have branches abroad, or just some of the larger industry-leading companies in a country, even if it is not a multinational. And so the thought process, which I don't necessarily agree with, is that the candidate from the larger company needs the MBA to advance to the top levels and, you know, be in the C-suite and eventually maybe be CEO. They need that top MBA. And so they tend to focus on those sort of candidates. And if you are coming from a small startup or a small business, they may look at you and say, you really don't need our MBA because there's really nothing to stop you from advancing your business if you don't have an MBA from an international school. And so sometimes the person who is at the startup or the small business and is a foreign national is facing a very big uphill battle to get into one of those top programs. The key thing is just be aware of that, and as you're writing the application, it doesn't mean that you cannot be successful. It just means that you have to indirectly address it in terms of what you're writing about, in terms of what you've learned through your work experience, what you can share, and where you intend to go in the long term. And again, profile does impact how big a concern this is. There are certain parts of the world where those big, large multinational companies are not very plentiful. And so, for instance, in Eastern Europe, the expectation would not be that an Eastern European candidate has to come from one of those big companies. And so a very successful small entrepreneur would most likely have a very strong shot still at the top programs. In Africa, there's the idea that these entrepreneurial ventures are the key to economic development, and so therefore if you have a woman who has been in a rapidly growing entrepreneurial venture that's doing very well, that candidate may be very successful still at some of the top programs. So you have to know how your background influences this calculation, but do be aware that the company can influence outcomes. And so for the last common mistake, number 11, conveying a generic personal story. And by generic, I simply mean something that when the committee reads it, they feel like they've read it 100 times already that year by candidates with your same profile. And so an example would be the two areas where you see the most common stories will be a candidate from India. So the typical story is that the candidate came from a very strong family with very strong values, a commitment to education, that because of that they gained certain values, they worked really hard in school, they had a top performance at a in the national exam, they got to a great university, then they graduate with first-class honors. That's a story that the committee will have heard again and again and again. So if you are called to write your personal story in the essays, that is your story. But what can make it work for you more is to find fresh and engaging ways to tell that story. And so there's all sorts of ways. You can add in anecdotes, you can add in descriptive details that just bring it to life in a way that other candidates may not be doing. So you need to take the extra step to do that. The other common story that I hear a lot is when an East Asian foreign national has moved to the USA, say 4 years back, and they went to school, and then they graduated and they worked for a while. That candidate might be writing about how hard it was to get to this new culture and then integrate, and then the challenge of learning English. That's a very common story. So again, if that is your story, you want to make sure that you do certain things to bring it to life so that you can distinguish yourself from the pack. And so the takeaway is that details and descriptive details matter. Okay, so I'm going to end it there. I do want to have time for Q&A, so I just do want to remind you of the wonderful things we're offering for your attendance today, and I would like you to definitely take the opportunity to sign up for the newsletter and feel free to be in touch with us. But I'm going to go ahead and try to take questions.
Hello, Dr. Shel. This is Jennifer with Beat the GMAT.
Great. Hi.
We lose you? Okay. I just wanted to make sure you're still there. Are you ready for the Q&A portion?
Yes, let's do some Q&A.
Excellent. Okay. Well, let's see. One of the first questions, what schools tend to be open in round 2?
Well, again, that is dependent on the profile of the candidate. And so there are certain schools that are known to admit pretty evenly in round 2. And so one example would be Yale. Another example might be Cornell. And then there's other schools that, again, are known to fill up pretty fast in round 1. And one example there would be Wharton. Another thing that people can think about is schools where the rounds are not quite as rigid as in the USA, and so an example of that would be INSEAD, where there are so many different entry points for INSEAD that if you miss one, you're not disadvantaged because the admissions is done totally separately for the next intake. And so, just doing your homework and understanding which schools those are, that would be very useful.
Okay. Another question. What if you are Indian, but you have done your undergrad from U.S.? Would that get into a different pool, perhaps less competitive?
I would say you're not in a different pool, but the thing that does hopefully help you is that your GPA is going to be crystal clear to them because it's a U.S. institution, and so they're going to have more data most likely from that school. And so if you had a 3.8 GPA, then you're obviously the top, and so it's just a lot easier and straightforward to establish the success in the academic arena. The only time, in my opinion, that you really see a difference is when someone is a permanent resident, because that's just a little bit different of the situation. But if someone is foreign national but had gone to the school in the USA, I still think you're considered in the same bucket and as foreign nationals, but that hopefully in most cases that I see, the GPA is quite strong, and so therefore that helps you.
Okay. Here's another question. Which one is better, or which one would you recommend, the TOEFL or the IELTS?
I think that you need to look at each school and how they perceive each of those. I more commonly have candidates who have taken the TOEFL, but that's a very school-specific choice, and so just do your homework with each of the schools. Some people question, okay, well, how can I get that information from the website? If you find that you cannot, then it is worthwhile. That's an easy question to just shoot an email to the school and ask them, do they have a preference, and take it from there.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Another question. So for perhaps the self-employed student, from where would you recommend they get a recommendation letter?
That's a universal concern for all folks who are running their own businesses. It's quite a challenge. And so I'm going to answer in two ways, because there's the person who's running their own entrepreneurship, and then there's the person who is in a family business. And they're very similar situations, but each one can be addressed somewhat differently. For the entrepreneur, so someone running their own business, then there's a business partner. So if you actually have clients, then that would be a natural place to go. And so you might end up needing to get 2 clients to write for you. If you have a partner, so a very big notable business partner, that would be an institution where you might go to get someone to write for you. And I mean an external partner. And then if you actually have a business partner, meaning someone who co-founded or is co-running the institution with you, then that person actually can write for you. And I've had many people receive very strong positive recommendations from the actual business partner. And of course, that person will support you, but they also give you great details about the sort of work that you're doing and the depth of the work and the breadth of the work. So that can be a very good and useful and powerful recommendation. In terms of the family business, the thing that is different with that is sometimes you're not the top, and so you've got a nice title, but it's actually your dad or your mom who is the boss. And so then you've got this big concern. Obviously you can't get your father or your mother to write your recommendation because they're going to only support you, so it will be seen as not objective. And so what you'd want to do is try to get someone superior to you who is in the company, but hopefully not a family member. And in some isolated cases, it really depends on the circumstances. Sometimes you can get someone who is either your peer or junior to you, but not a family member who is able to write. But otherwise, you do what the entrepreneur does, which is think about clients, think about business partners, and see if some of those folks can do it, because the blood tie will make them assume that the recommendation is biased. And so you need to choose someone who's perceived as more objective.
Okay, thank you. All right, here's another question. What would you advise to a candidate who is from an overrepresented student population? For example, Indian, IT, male. How can they look to differentiate their story?
Well, there are many dimensions to the application, so to your candidacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so those dimensions include, the professional things that you've done, the extracurricular things that you've done, and academic things that you've done. And so in those different dimensions, what you tend to see that's the same is the personal story. I mean, it's similar. And so even in the personal story, you can, go do your work and try to figure out what is distinguishing, even if the story on the first glance looks a little more similar, and distinguish in that way. But usually in these other arenas, you can distinguish yourself, that you extracurricularly you might have done things that were more interesting, more diverse, more leadership oriented than many of your competitors, and so you should be highlighting those things. And then professionally, the same thing, that you might have had some opportunities in your professional role that were different or maybe even beyond your typical role that you can highlight. And then additionally, within the workplace, your achievements don't need to be restricted only to your professional role. They could actually be beyond that. So you could have been named to committees or have started certain things, certain committees or certain groups in the company, and that is additional information that you can bring to the table. So there's many, many ways to distinguish yourself. When I'm working with an Indian foreign national who's in IT, I'm not normally worried about them looking generic because there's so many layers and so many different ways that you can distinguish yourself. It's truly just knowing what those are and implementing that.
All right, thank you. Here's another good question. For the student who may already have a master's or even an MBA from their national country, is that viewed as a disadvantage?
Well, I'm going to answer, those are almost two different questions, so let me answer both. So let me start with the MBA. When you have an MBA already, that can actually be an option, an obstacle to getting even your application seriously considered. And it is a school-based policy, so you have to actually contact each of the schools that you want to apply to and ask them what is their policy about admitting a candidate who already has an MBA. And you should be specific about where you received your MBA, how long ago, and so forth, and just see what they will do. Some schools will not consider an application from a candidate who has an MBA already. And then the master's is a separate issue. Now, many candidates do have master's degrees, and the biggest point of concern is, when did you get that degree? So if you got it 4 years ago and then you've had 4 years of work experience, there's usually not a problem because you have 4 years of work experience. You're showing that you are rooted in business, and you've been focused, that you're serious about building a strong business career. So there's usually not a problem. If it's recent, so say you had 2 years of work experience and then you've taken the master's recently and now you're applying for an MBA, the school will want to hear an explanation. Why did you go get the other master's? And there might be a very good reason. And then they want to have assurance that you are not a professional student. So there are some people who literally just go get one degree after another, after another, after another, and they never really do have a big career because they're just always in school. So they want to make sure you're not one of those people. So you would need to explain why you did the other masters and persuade them that your long-term goal that you're putting forward is actually a serious goal, that you are moving toward it. And so that would be the challenge. But otherwise, the master's degrees don't pose problems, and hopefully you received a strong GPA in the master's, because many times candidates get a master's because they had a lower GPA undergrad and they want to correct that, and usually that can shift things for you because the most recent GPA is usually the one that the committee will focus on the most. And in those cases where someone actually had a lower performance in the master's degree, usually I've seen candidates be able to work around that, and they can still be successful even if the master's GPA was lower as long as they had a strong performance in the undergraduate degree. So hopefully that answers the question sufficiently.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further advice you can give to our community on how they can help develop their personal stories to help them stand out a little bit more?
For every candidate, it is so different, and so I don't think there's really a one-size-fit-all way to do it. But when you think about, what, first of all, what is your philosophy of life, and what are you passionate about, and even, what is your long-term goal, and where did all that come from? And so the basic question is, where did those passions and interests come from? And if you can trace that to certain things, then that can become a strong personal story. And as I said, there's certain people who came out of great adversity. So you've got the person who was raised in rural Africa where they were living in a mud hut with no electricity and no running water. They made it to a top university in their country, and then they have a flourishing career. That is a very strong personal story. But not everybody has to have a story like that. Other people, I've had very wealthy candidates who are going to inherit multinational family businesses. They can also talk about, even though they came from that privilege, why is it they're passionate about using those resources for having a positive impact in the world. So that can also still be a strong personal story. For every candidate, it is somewhat different, and so you need to take a really good, strong look at your whole background, but maybe the starting point is, what am I passionate about? What am I saying my long-term goal is? What are my interests? And where did that come from? And then start to develop it based on that. Are there any additional questions? I think we probably have time for 2 more.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we had, I had one more question for you.
Sure.
Any advice or tips that you could give for that student who is trying to overcome perhaps a low GPA or even low GMAT score?
Well, when you are a foreign national candidate, it really can be difficult. And so I think between the two, the harder to overcome is the low GPA, which is actually the opposite. If it was an American candidate, the harder to overcome is the low GMAT score. But for the foreign national, it is the GPA that's harder to overcome, because you're going to have so many people from your country that will have strong GPAs. And there's only going to be so many seats that the schools are allotting to foreign nationals that the school really doesn't have much rationale to let someone in with the lower GPA. But the GMAT score is sometimes a reflection of, were you taught in English, how strong was your college at all, so maybe you had a top GPA but your college was not this huge national college. And so if you have a lower GMAT score, I think you can still get to the United States or to Europe to study, but it may not be one of the top 20 schools. You may be going to, a top 25 or top 30 school. And so if you're open to that, then you probably still have options, even with a lower GMAT score. But with a low GPA, I do think that it can be more challenging. And then again, it's going to depend on what country are you from and where are you aiming. So if I get someone who's from the Middle East and they're aiming for INSEAD, or they're aiming for London Business School, they may have a shot even with the lower lower GPA, because the ties between the regions are so strong, and so they just may have more opportunity to get around that. Whereas if it's someone from Japan applying to the USA and they've got the low GPA, the volume of people from Japan who are applying with high GPAs will just be probably so high and so full in terms of volume that that GPA may be really hard to get around to in order to get into a top MBA program. I do have one more thing I do want to address. It's a very common question I get from foreign nationals, and that is scholarships. People are always asking me, how do I find out what schools offer scholarships? And there's multiple ways, but many of my candidates, when they apply, they get unsolicited scholarships, meaning they did not ask for the scholarship, but the school finds them to be attractive enough and of the right caliber of a candidate that they want the student. and to give them the extra incentive to choose them, they will offer an unsolicited scholarship. And so those can range from full to $50,000 to $80,000. And then there's certain schools that actually make it very clear that they have scholarships that apply to foreign students. For an example, Haas is one of those, and they offer, there's this long list of scholarships that one can take a look at and apply for. And so, just make sure that you are asking each of the schools. If you don't see that information readily, just ask them, is there a certain location I can go to see what are, scholarships offered to students? Because sometimes it comes from private funders, sometimes it's within the school. And, do that homework if it's very important to you to get some financial assistance in the process.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Shel.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here as always. Feel free to be in touch with us, and hope you take advantage of some of the offers we gave today. But thank you again for attending this wonderful webinar with Beat the GMAT, and thanks again to Beat the GMAT.